Welcome to this collection of 4 sci-fi short stories by Evelyn E. Smith, one of the great writers of the 50s. I'll be narrating The Most Sentimental Man, The Vilbar Party, The Man Outside, and Man's Best Friend. If you find yourself enjoying the stories, know that you can get many more great stories like this on my Patreon, including the exclusive novelette Once a Greech by Evelyn E. Smith. You'll also get 6-month early access to full novels I narrate and ad-free audio and video versions of all stories. Get all that at patreon.com/storiesfromthesky_SFF, link in the description. But for now, let's get to the stories, so sit back, relax, and enjoy. The Most Sentimental Man by Evelyn E. Smith. Narrated by William Sky. Once these irritating farewells were over with, he could begin to live as he wished and as he dreamed. Johnson went to see the others off at Idlewild. He knew they'd expect him to, and since it would be the last conventional gesture he'd have to make, he might as well conform to their notions of what was right and proper. For the past few centuries, the climate had been getting hotter. Now, even though it was not yet June, the day was uncomfortably warm. The sun's rays glinting off the bright metal flanks of the ship dazzled his eyes, and perspiration made his shirt stick to his shoulder blades beneath a jacket that the formality of the occasion had required. He wished Clifford would hurry up and get the leave-taking over with. But even though Clifford was undoubtedly even more anxious than he to finish with all the ceremony and take off, he wasn't the kind of man to let inclination influence his actions. "Sure you won't change your mind and come with us?" Johnson shook his head. The young man looked at him, hatred for the older man's complication of what should have been a simple departure showing through the pellicule of politeness. He was young, for since this trip had only slight historical importance and none of any other kind, the authorities had felt a junior officer entirely sufficient. It was clear, however, that Clifford attributed his commandership to his merits, and he was very conscious of his great responsibility. "We have plenty of room on the ship," he persisted. "There weren't many left to go. We could take you easily enough, you know." Johnson made a negative sign again. The rays of the sun beating full upon his head made apparent the grey that usually blended into the still thick blonde hair. Yet, though past youth, he was far from being an old man. "I've made my decision," he said, remembering that anger now was pointless. If you're just too proud to change your mind," the young commander said, less certainly, "I'm sure everyone will understand if... Johnson smiled. "No, it's just that I want to stay, that's all." But the commander's clear blue eyes were still baffled, uneasy, as though he felt he had not done the utmost that duty, not duty to the service but to humanity, required. That was the trouble with people, Johnson thought. When they were most well-meaning, they became most troublesome. Clifford lowered his voice to an appropriately funeral hush, as a fresh thought obviously struck him. "I know, of course, that your loved ones are buried here, and perhaps you feel it's your duty to stay with them?" At this, Johnson almost forgot that anger no longer had any validity. By loved ones, Clifford undoubtedly had meant Eleanor and Paul. It was true that Johnson had had a certain affection for his wife and son when they were alive. Now that they were dead, they represented an episode in his life that had not perhaps been unpleasant, but was certainly over and done with now. Did Clifford think that was his reason for remaining? Why, he must believe Johnson to be the most sentimental man on earth. "And come to think of it," Johnson said to himself, amused, "I am, or soon will be, just that." The commander was still unconsciously pursuing the same train of thought. "It does seem incredible," he said in a burst of boyish candour that did not become him, for he was not that young, "that you'd want to stay alone on a whole planet. I mean to say, entirely alone. There'll never be another ship, you know, at least not in your lifetime." Johnson knew what the other man was thinking. If there'd been a woman with Johnson now, Clifford might have been able to understand a little better how the other could stick by his decision. Johnson wriggled as sweat oozed stickily down his back. "For God's sake," he said silently, "take your silly ship and get the hell off my planet." Aloud, he said, "It's a good planet, a little worn out, but still in pretty good shape. Pity you can't trade in an old world like an old car, isn't it?" "If it weren't so damned far from the center of things," the young man replied, defensively assuming the burden of all civilization, "we wouldn't abandon it. After all, we hate leaving the world on which we originated. But it's a long haul to Alpha Centauri, you know that, and a tremendously expensive one. Keeping up this place solely out of sentiment would be sheer waste. The people would never stand for the tax burden." "A costly museum, yes," Johnson agreed. How much longer were these dismal farewells going to continue? How much longer would the young man still feel the need to justify himself? "If only there were others fool enough. If only there were others with you. But even if anybody else would be willing to cut himself off entirely from the rest of the civilized universe, the Earth won't support enough of a population to keep it running. Not according to our present living standards, anyway. Most of its resources are gone, you know. Hardly any coal or oil left, and that's not worth digging for when there are better and cheaper fuels in the system." He was virtually quoting from the Colonial Officer's Manual. Were there any people left able to think for themselves, Johnson wondered. Had there ever been? Had he thought for himself in making his decision, or was he merely clinging to a childish dream that all men had had and lost? "With man gone, Earth will replenish herself," he said aloud. First the vegetation would begin to grow thick. Already it had released itself from the restraint of cultivation. Soon it would be spreading out over the continent, overrunning the cities with delicately persistent green tendrils. Some the harsh winters would kill, but others would live on and would multiply. Vines would twist themselves about the tall buildings and tenderly, passionately squeeze them to death, eventually send them tumbling down. And then the trees would rear themselves in their places. The swamps that man had filled in would begin to reappear one by one as the land sank back to a pristine state. The sea would go on changing her boundaries with no dikes to stop her. Volcanoes would heave up the land into different configurations. The heat would increase until it grew unbearable. Only there would be no one, no human anyway, to bear it. Year after year the leaves would wither and fall and decay. Rock would cover them. And someday, billions of years thence, there would be coal and oil, and nobody to want them. "Very likely Earth will replenish herself," the commander agreed. "But not in your time, or your children's time. That is, not in my children's time," he added hastily. The handful of men lined up in a row before the airlock shuffled their feet and allowed their muttering to become a few decibels louder. Clifford looked at his wrist chronometer. Obviously he was no less anxious than the crew to be off, but for the sake of his conscience, he must make a last try. Damn your conscience, Johnson thought. I hope that for this you feel guilty as hell, that you wake up nights in a cold sweat remembering that you left one man alone on the planet you and your kind discarded. Not that I don't want to stay, mind you, but that I want you to suffer the way you're making me suffer now, having to listen to your platitudes. The commander suddenly stopped paraphrasing the manual. Camping out's fun for a week or two, you know, but it's different when it's for a lifetime. Johnson's fingers curled in his palms. He was even angrier now that the commander had struck so close to home. Camping out. Was that all he was doing? Fulfilling childhood desires? Nothing more? Fortunately, Clifford didn't realize that he had scored and scuttled back to the shelter of the manual. Perhaps you don't know enough about the new system in Alpha Centauri, he said, a trifle wildly. It has 2 suns surrounded by 3 planets, Thalia, Aglaia, and Euphrosyne. Each of these planets is slightly smaller than Earth, so that the decrease in gravity is just great enough to be pleasant, without being so marked as to be inconvenient. The atmosphere is almost exactly like that of Earth's, except that it contains several beneficial elements which are absent here, and the climate is more temperate. Owing to the fact that the planets are partially shielded from the suns by cloud layers, the temperature, except immediately at the poles and the equators, where it is slightly more extreme, is always equable, resembling that of Southern California. Sounds charming, said Johnson. I too have read the Colonial Office handouts. I wonder what the people who wrote them will do now that there's no longer any necessity for attracting colonists. Everybody's already up in Alpha Centauri. Oh well, there'll be other systems to conquer and colonize. The word conquer is hardly correct, the commander said stiffly, since not one of the 3 planets had any indigenous life forms that was intelligent. Or life forms that you recognized as intelligent, Johnson suggested gently. Although why should there be such a premium placed on intelligence, he wondered. Was intelligence the sole criterion on which the right to life and to freedom should be based? The commander frowned and looked at his chronometer again. Well, he finally said, since you feel that way and you're sure you've quite made up your mind, my men are anxious to go. Of course they are, Johnson said, managing to convey just the right amount of reproach. Clifford flushed and started to walk away. I'll stand out of the way of your jets, Johnson called after him. It would be so anticlimactic to have me burned to a crisp after all this. Bon voyage. There was no reply. Johnson watched the silver vessel shoot up into the sky and thought, now is the time for me to feel a pang, or even a twinge, but I don't at all. I feel relieved, in fact, but that's probably the result of getting rid of that fool Clifford. He crossed the field briskly, pulling off his jacket and discarding his tie as he went. His ground car remained where he had parked it, in an area clearly marked no parking. They'd left him an old car that wasn't worth shipping to the stars. How long it would last was anybody's guess. The government hadn't been deliberately illiberal in leaving him such a shabby vehicle. If there had been any way to ensure a continuing supply of fuel, they would probably have left him a reasonably good one. But since only a little could be left, allowing him a good car would have been simply an example of conspicuous waste, and the government had always preferred its waste to be inconspicuous. He drove slowly through the broad boulevards of Long Island, savouring the loneliness. New York as a residential area had been a ghost town for years, since the greater part of its citizens had been among the first to emigrate to the stars. However, since it was the capital of the world, and most of the interstellar ships, particularly the last few, had taken off from its spaceports, it had been kept up as an official embarkation centre. Thus, paradoxically, it was the last city to be completely evacuated, and so, although the massive but jerry-built apartment houses that lined the streets were already crumbling, the roads had been kept in fairly good shape and were hardly cracked at all. Still, here and there the green was pushing its way up in unlikely places. A few more of New York's tropical summers, and Long Island would soon become a wilderness. The streets were empty, except for the cats sunning themselves on long abandoned doorsteps or padding about on obscure errands of their own. Perhaps their numbers had not increased since humanity had left the city to them, but there certainly seemed to be more, striped and solid, black and grey and white and tawny, accepting their citizenship with equanimity. They paid no attention to Johnson. They had long since dissociated themselves from a humanity that had not concerned itself greatly over their welfare. On the other hand, neither he nor the surface car appeared to startle them. The old ones had seen such before, and to kittens the very fact of existence is the ultimate surprise. The Queensborough Bridge was deadly silent. It was completely empty except for a calico cat moving purposefully toward Manhattan. The structure needed a coat of paint, Johnson thought vaguely, but of course it would never get one. Still, even uncared for, the bridges should outlast him. There would be no heavy traffic to weaken them. Just in case of unforeseeable catastrophe, however, he didn't want to be trapped on an island, even Manhattan Island. He had remembered to provide himself with a rowboat. A motorboat would have been preferable, but then the fuel difficulty would arise again. How empty the East River looked without any craft on it. It was rather a charming little waterway in its own right, though nothing to compare with the stately Hudson. The water scintillated in the sunshine, and the air was clear and fresh, for no factories had spewed fumes and smoke into it for many years. There were few gulls, for nothing was left for the scavenger. Those remaining were forced to make an honest living by catching fish. In Manhattan, where the buildings had been more soundly constructed, the signs of abandonment were less evident. Empty streets, an occasional cracked window. Not even an unusual amount of dirt, because in the past the normal activities of an industrial and ruggedly individual city had provided more grime than years of neglect could ever hope to equal. No, it would take Manhattan longer to go back than Long Island. Perhaps that too would not happen during his lifetime. Yet, after all, when he reached Fifth Avenue, he found that Central Park had burst its boundaries. 59th Street was already half jungle, and the lush growth spilled down the avenues and spread raggedly out into the side streets, pushing its way up through the cracks it had made in the surface of the roads. Although the plaza fountain had not flowed for centuries, water had collected in the leaf-choked basin from the last rain, and a group of grey squirrels were gathered around it, shrilly disputing possession with some starlings. Except for the occasional cry of a cat in the distance, these voices were all that he heard, the only sound. Not even the sudden blast of a jet regaining power. He would never hear that again. Never hear the stridor of a human voice piercing with anger, the cacophony of 100 television sets each playing a different program, the hoot of a horn, off-key singing, the thin, uncertain notes of an amateur musician. These would never be heard on Earth again. He sent the car gliding slowly, no more traffic rules, down Fifth Avenue. The buildings here also were well built. They were many centuries old and would probably last as many more. The shop windows were empty except for tangles of dust, an occasional broken, discarded mannequin. In some instances, the glass had already cracked or fallen out. Since there were no children to throw stones, however, others might last indefinitely, carefully glassing in nothingness. Doors stood open, and he could see rows of empty counters and barren shelves fuzzed high with the dust of the years since a customer had approached them. Cats sedately walked up and down the avenue or sat genteelly with tails tucked in on the steps of the cathedral, as if the place had been theirs all along. Dusk was falling. Tonight, for the first time in centuries, the street lamps would not go on. Undoubtedly, when it grew dark, he would see ghosts. But they would be the ghosts of the past, and he had made his peace with the past long since. It was the present and the future with which he had not come to terms. And now there would be no present, no past, no future, but all merged into one, and he was the only one. At 42nd Street, pigeons fluttered thickly around the public library, fat as ever, their numbers greater, their appetites grosser. The ancient library, he knew, had changed little inside. Stacks and shelves would still be packed thick with reading matter. Books are bulky, so only the rare editions had been taken beyond the stars. The rest had been microfilmed, and their originals left to Johnson and decay. It was his library now, and he had all the time in the world to read all the books in the world, for there were more than he could possibly read in the years that, even at the most generous estimate, were left to him. He had been wondering where to make his permanent residence, for with the whole world his, he would be a fool to confine himself to some modest dwelling. Now he fancied it might be a good idea to move right into the library. Very few places in Manhattan could boast a garden of their own. He stopped the car to stare thoughtfully at the little park behind the grimy monument to neoclassicism. Like Central Park, Bryant had already slipped its boundaries and encroached upon 6th Avenue, Avenue of the World, the street sign said now, and before that it had been Avenue of the Nations and Avenue of the Americas. But to the public, it had always been 6th Avenue, and to Johnson, the last man on Earth, it was 6th Avenue. He'd live in the library, while he stayed in New York, that was. He'd thought that in a few weeks, when it got really hot, he might strike north. He had always meant to spend a summer in Canada. His surface car would probably never last the trip, but the Museum of Ancient Vehicles had been glad to bestow half a dozen of the bicycles from their exhibits upon him. After all, he was, in effect, a museum piece himself, and so as worth preserving as the bicycles. Moreover, bicycles are difficult to pack for an interstellar trip. With reasonable care, these might last him his lifetime. But he had to have a permanent residence somewhere, and the library was an elegant and commodious dwelling, centrally located. New York would have to be his headquarters, for all the possessions he had carefully amassed and collected and begged, and, since money would do him no good anymore, bought, were here. And there were by far too many of them to be transported to any really distant location. He loved to own things. He was by no means an advocate of Rousseau's complete return to nature. Whatever civilization had left that he could use without compromise, he would, and thankfully. There would be no electricity, of course, but he had provided himself with flashlights and bulbs and batteries, not too many of the last, of course, because they'd grow stale. However, he'd also laid in plenty of candles and a vast supply of matches. Tins of food and concentrates and synthetics, packages of seeds should he grow tired of all these and want to try growing his own. Fruit, he knew, would be growing wild soon enough. Vitamins and medicines. Of course, were he to get really ill or get hurt in some way, it might be the end. But that was something he wouldn't think of, something that couldn't possibly happen to him. For his relaxation, he had an antique hand-wound phonograph, together with thousands of old-fashioned records. And then, of course, he had the whole planet, the whole world to amuse him. He even had provided himself with a heat-ray gun and a substantial supply of ammunition, although he couldn't imagine himself ever killing an animal for food. It was squeamishness that stood in his way, rather than any ethical considerations, although he did indeed believe that every creature had the right to live. Nonetheless, there was the possibility that the craving for fresh meat might change his mind for him. Besides, although hostile animals had long been gone from this part of the world, the only animals would be birds and squirrels, and further up the Hudson, rabbits and chipmunks and deer, perhaps an occasional bear in the mountains. Who knew what harmless life form might become a threat now that its development would be left unchecked? A cat sitting atop one of the stately stone lions outside the library met his eye with such a steady gaze of understanding, though not of sympathy, that he found himself needing to repeat the by now almost magic phrase to himself. Not in my lifetime, anyway. Would some intelligent life form develop to supplant man? Or would the planet revert to a primeval state of mindless innocence? He would never know, and he didn't really care. No point in speculating over unanswerable questions. He settled back luxuriously on the worn cushions of his car. Even so little as 20 years before, it would have been impossible for him, for anyone, to stop his vehicle in the middle of 42nd Street and 5th Avenue purely to meditate. But it was his domain now. He could go in the wrong direction on one-way streets, stop wherever he pleased, drive as fast or as slowly as he would, and could, of course. If he wanted to do anything as vulgar as spit in the street, he could, but they were his streets now, not to be sullied. Cross the roads without waiting for the lights to change? It would be a long, long wait if he did. Go to sleep when he wanted, eat as many meals as he wanted whenever he chose. He could go naked in hot weather, and there'd be no one to raise an eyebrow. Deface public buildings, except that they were private buildings now, his buildings. Idle without the guilty feeling that there was always something better he could and should be doing, even if there were not. There would be no more guilty feelings. Without people and their knowledge, there was no more guilt. A flash of movement in the bushes behind the library caught his eye. Surely that couldn't be a fawn in Bryant Park. So soon? He thought it would be another 10 years at least before the wild animals came sniffing timidly along the Hudson, venturing a little further each time they saw no sign of their age-old enemy. But probably the deer was only his imagination. He would investigate further after he had moved into the library. Perhaps a higher building than the library. But then he would have to climb too many flights of stairs. The elevators wouldn't be working. Silly of him to forget that. There were a lot of steps outside the library, too. It would be a chore to get his bicycles up those steps. Then he smiled to himself. Robinson Crusoe would have been glad to have had bicycles and steps and such relatively harmless animals as bears to worry about. No, Robinson Crusoe never had it so good as he, Johnson, would have, and what more could he want? For whoever before in history had had his dreams, and what was wrong with dreams after all, so completely gratified? What child envisioning a desert island all his own could imagine that his island would be the whole world? Together, Johnson and the earth would grow young again. No, the stars were for others. Johnson was not the first man in history who had wanted the earth, but he had been the first man, and probably the last, who had actually been given it. and he was well content with his bargain. There was plenty of room for the bears, too. The Vilbar Party by Evelyn E. Smith. Narrated by William Skye. Nuts to you, was what gnarly new Earthmen would tell him. Only it was Frismill nuts. The Purzils are giving a Vilbar party tomorrow night, Professor Slood said cajolingly. You will come this time, won't you, Gnarly? Gnarly Xan rubbed his forehead fretfully. You know how I feel about parties, Khan. He took a Frismill nut out of the tray on his desk and nibbled it in annoyance. But this is in your honour, Gnarly, a farewell party. You must go. It would be unthinkable if you didn't. Khan Slood's eyes were pleading. He could not possibly be held responsible for his friend's antisocial behaviour, and yet Gnarly knew he would somehow feel at fault. Gnarly sighed. He supposed he would have to conform to public sentiment in this particular instance, but he was damned if he would give in gracefully. After all, what's so special about the occasion? I'm just leaving to take another teaching job, that's all. He took another nut. That's all? Slood's face swelled with emotion. You can't really be that indifferent. Another job, that's all it is to me, Gnarly persisted. At an exceptionally high salary, of course, or I wouldn't dream of accepting a position so inconveniently located. Slood was baffled and hurt and outraged. You have been honoured by being the first of our people to be offered an exchange professorship on another planet, he said stiffly. And you call it just another job. Why, I would have given my right antenna to get it. Gnarly realised that he had again overstepped the invisible boundary between candour and tactlessness. He poked at the nuts with a stylus. Honoured by being the first of our species to be offered a guinea pig ship, he murmured. He had not considered this aspect of the matter before, but now that it occurred to him, he was probably right. Oh, I don't mind really, he waved away the other's sudden commiseration. You know I like being alone most of the time, so I won't find that uncomfortable. Students are students, whether they're terrestrials or Saturnians. I suppose they'll laugh at me behind my back, but then even here my students always did that. He gave a hollow laugh and unobtrusively put out one of his hands for a nut. At least on Earth I'll know why they're laughing. There was pain on Slood's expressive face as he firmly removed the nut tray from his friend's reach. I didn't think of it from that angle, Gnarly. Of course you're right. Human beings, from what I've read of them, are not noted for tolerance. It will be difficult, but I'm sure you'll be able to, he choked on the kindly lie, win them over. Gnarly repressed a bitter laugh. Anyone less likely than he to win over a hostile alien species through sheer personal charm could hardly be found on Saturn. Gnarly Xan had been chosen as first exchange professor between Saturn and Earth because of his academic reputation, not his personality. But although the choosers had probably not had that aspect of the matter in mind, the choice, he thought, was a wise one. As an individual of solitary habits, he was not apt to be much lonelier on one planet than another. And he had accepted the post largely because he felt that, as an alien being, he would be left strictly alone. This would give him the chance to put in a lot of work on his definitive history of the solar system, a monumental project from which he begrudged all the time he had to spend in fulfilling even the minimum obligations expected of a professor on sociable Saturn. The salary was a weighty factor too. Not only was it more than twice what he had been getting, but since there would be no necessity for spending more than enough for bare subsistence, he would be able to save up a considerable amount and retire while still comparatively young. It was pleasant to imagine a scholarly life unafflicted by students. He could put up with a good deal for that goal. But how could he alleviate the distress he saw on Khan's face? He did not consciously want to hurt the only person who, for some strange reason, seemed to be fond of him, so he said the only thing he could think of to please. "All right, Khan, I'll go to the Purzils tomorrow night." It would be a deadly bore, parties always were, and he would eat too much, but after all, the thought that it would be a long time before he'd see any of his own kind again would make the affair almost endurable. And just this once, it would be all right for him to eat as much as he wanted. When he was on Earth out of reach of decent food, he would probably trim down considerably. "I just know you're going to love Earth, Professor Xan," the hostess on the interplanetary liner gushed. "I'm sure I shall," he lied politely. She smiled at him too much, overdoing her professional cordiality. Underneath the effusiveness, he sensed the repulsion. Of course, he couldn't blame her for trying not to show her distaste for the strange creature. The effort at concealment was, as a matter of fact, more than he had expected from a terrestrial. But he wished she would leave him alone to meditate. He had planned to get a lot of meditation done on the journey. "You speak awfully good English," she told him. He looked at her. "I'm said to have some scholarly aptitude. I understand that's why I was chosen as an exchange professor. It does seem reasonable, doesn't it?" She turned pink, a sign of embarrassment with these creatures, he had learned. "I didn't mean to question your ability, Professor. It's just that, well, you don't look like a professor." "Indeed?" he said frostily. "And what do I look like, then?" She turned even rosier. "Oh, I don't know exactly. It's just that, well..." And she fled. He couldn't resist flicking his antennae forward to catch her sotto voce conversation with the co-pilot. It was so seldom you got the chance to learn what others were saying about you behind your back. "But I could hardly tell him he looks like a teddy bear, could I?" "He probably doesn't even know what a teddy bear is." "Perhaps I don't," Gnarly thought resentfully, "but I can guess." With low cunning, the terrestrial seemed to have ferreted out the identity of all his favourite dishes and kept serving them to him incessantly. By the time the ship made planetfall on Earth, he had gained 10 grisbuts. "Oh well," he thought. "I suppose it's all just part of the regular diplomatic service. On Earth, I'll have to eat crude native foods, so I'll lose all the weight again." President Purrington of North America came himself to meet Gnarly at the airfield, because Gnarly was the first interplanetary exchange professor in history. "Welcome to our planet, Professor Xan," he said with warm diplomatic cordiality, wringing Gnarly's upper right hand after a moment of indecision. "We shall do everything in our power to make your stay here a happy and memorable one." "I wish you would begin by doing something about the climate," Gnarly thought. It was stupid of him not to have realized how hot it would be on Earth. He was really going to suffer in this torrid climate, especially in the tight terrestrial costume he wore over his fur for the sake of conformity. Of course, justice compelled him to admit to himself the clothes wouldn't have become so snug if he hadn't eaten quite so much on board ship. Purrington indicated the female beside him. "May I introduce my wife?" "Oh," the female gasped. "Isn't he cute?" The president and Gnarly stared at her in consternation. She looked abashed for a moment, then smiled widely at Gnarly and the press photographers. "Welcome to Earth, dear Professor Xan," she exclaimed, mispronouncing his name, of course. Bending down, she kissed him right upon his fuzzy forehead. Kissing was not a Saturnian practice, nor did Gnarly approve of it. However, he had read enough about Earth to know that Europeans sometimes greeted dignitaries in this particular way. Only this place, he had been given to understand, was not Europe, but America. "I am having a cocktail party in your honor this afternoon," she beamed, smoothing her flowered print dress down over her girdle. "You'll be there at 5 sharp, won't you, dear?" "Delighted," he promised dismally. He could hardly plead a previous engagement a moment after arriving. "I've tried to get all the things you like to eat," she went on anxiously. "But you will tell me if there's anything special, won't you?" "I am on a diet," he said. He must be strong. Probably the food would be repulsive anyhow, so he'd have no difficulty controlling his appetite. Digestive disorders, you know. A glass of Vichy and a biscuit will be—" He stopped, for there were tears in Mrs. Purrington's eyes. "Your tummy hurts? Oh, you poor little darling." "Gladys," the President said sharply. There were Frismill nuts at Mrs. Purrington's cocktail party, and Vilbar, and even Slipness Broogs, all imported at fabulous expense, Gnarly knew. But then this was a government affair, and expense means nothing to a government since, as far as it is concerned, money grows on taxpayers. Some of the native foods proved surprisingly palatable too. Pâté de foie gras and champagne, and little puff pastries full of delightful surprises. Gnarly was afraid he was making a zloogle of himself. However, he thought, trying not to catch sight of his own portly person in the mirrors that walled the room, the lean days were just ahead. Besides, what could he do when everyone insisted on pressing food on him? "Try this, Professor Xan. Do try that, Professor Xan. Doesn't he look cunning in his little dress suit?" They crowded around him. The women cooed, the men beamed, and Gnarly ate. He would be glad when he could detach himself from all this cloying diplomacy and get back to the healthy rancor of the classroom. At school, the odour of chalk dust, ink, and rotting apple cores was enough like its Saturnian equivalent to make Gnarly feel at home immediately. The students would dislike him on sight, he knew. It is in the nature of the young to be hostile toward whatever is strange and alien. They would despise him and jeer at him, and he, in his turn, would give them long, involved homework assignments and such difficult examinations that they would fail. Gnarly waddled briskly up to his desk, which had, he saw, been scaled down to Saturnian size, whereas he had envisioned himself struggling triumphantly with ordinary Earth-sized furniture. But the atmosphere was as hot and sticky and intolerable as he had expected. Panting as unobtrusively as possible, he rapped with his pointer. "Attention, students!" Now should come the derisive babble. But there was a respectful silence, broken suddenly by a shrill feminine whisper of, "Ooh, he's so adorable," followed by the harsh, "Shh, Ava! You'll embarrass the poor little thing." Gnarly's face swelled. "I am your new professor of Saturnian studies. Saturn, as you probably know, is a major planet. It is much larger and more important than Earth, which is only a minor planet." The students obediently took this down in their notebooks. They carefully took down everything he said. Even a bout of coughing that afflicted him halfway through seemed to be getting a phonetic transcription. From time to time they would interrupt his lecture with questions so pertinent, so well thought out, and so courteous that all he could do was answer them. His antennae lifted to catch the whispers that from time to time were exchanged between even the best-behaved of the students. "Isn't he precious? Seems like a nice fellow, sound grasp of his subject. Sweet little thing. Unusually interesting presentation. Doesn't he remind you of Winnie the Pooh? Able chap. Just darling." After class, instead of rushing out of the room, they hovered around his desk with intelligent, solicitous questions. Did he like Earth? Was his desk too high? Too low? Didn't he find it hot with all that fur? Such lovely, soft, fluffy fur, though. "Do you mind if I stroke one of your hands, Professor? So cuddly looking." He said yes, as a matter of fact he was hot, and no, he didn't mind being touched in a spirit of scientific investigation. He had a moment of uplift at the teacher's cafeteria when he discovered lunch to be virtually inedible. The manager, however, had been distressed to see him pick at his food, and by dinner time, a distinguished chef with an expert knowledge of Saturnian cuisine had been rushed from Washington. Since the school food was inedible for all intelligent life forms, everyone ate the Saturnian dishes and praised Gnarly as a public benefactor. That night, alone in the quiet confines of his small room at the men's faculty club, Gnarly had spread out his notes and was about to start work on his history, when there was a knock at the door. He trotted over to open it, grumbling to himself. The head of his department smiled brightly down at him. "Some of us are going out for a couple of drinks and a gabfest. Care to come along?" Gnarly did not see how he could refuse and still carry the Saturnian's burden, so he accepted. Discovering that gin fizzes and Alexander's were even more palatable than champagne and more potent than Vilbar, he told several saturnine locker room stories, which were hailed with loud merriment. But he was being laughed at, not with, he knew. All this false cordiality, he assured himself, would die down after a couple of days, and then he would be able to get back to work. He must curb his intellectual impatience. In the morning, he found that enrollment in his classes had doubled, and the room was crowded to capacity with the bright, shining, eager faces of young terrestrials athirst for learning. There were apples, chocolates, and imported Frismill nuts on his desk, as well as a pressing invitation from Mrs. Purrington for him to spend all his weekends and holidays at the White House. The window was fitted with an air conditioning unit, which he later discovered his classes had chipped in to buy for him, and the temperature had been lowered to a point where it was almost comfortable. All the students wore coats. When he went out on the campus, women, students, teachers, even strangers stopped to talk to him, to exclaim over him, to touch him, even to kiss him. Photographers were perpetually taking pictures, some of which turned up in the student union as full-colour postcards. They sold like Lajal out of season. Gnarly wrote in Saturnian on the back of one, "Having miserable time, be glad you're not here," and sent it to Slood. There were cocktail parties, musicales, and balls in Gnarly's honour. When he tried to refuse an invitation, he was accused of shyness and virtually dragged to the affair by laughing members of the faculty. He put on so much weight that he had to buy a complete new terrestrial outfit, which set him back a pretty penny. As a result, he had to augment his income by lecturing to women's clubs. They slobbered appallingly. Gnarly's students did all their homework assiduously, and in fact put in more work than had been assigned. At the end of the year, not only did all of them pass, but with flying colours. "I hope you'll remember, Professor Xan," the president of the university said, "that there will always be a job waiting for you here, a non-exchange professorship. Love to have you." "Thank you," Gnarly replied politely. Mrs. Purrington broke into loud sobs when he told her he was leaving the earth. "Oh, I'll miss you so, Gnarly. You will write, won't you?" "Yes, of course," he said grimly. That made 218 people to whom he'd had to promise to write. It was fortunate he was travelling as a guest of the North American government, he thought, as he supervised the loading of his matched interplanetary luggage. His 8 steamer baskets, his leather-bound Encyclopedia Terrestria with his name imprinted in gold on each volume, his Indian war bonnet, his oil painting of the president, and his 6 cases of champagne, all parting gifts, onto the liner. Otherwise, the fee for excess luggage would take what little remained of his bank account. There had been so many expenses, clothes and hostess gifts and ice. Not all his mementos were in his luggage. A new rare metal watch gleamed on each of his 4 furry wrists. A brand new Trobskin wallet, platinum keychain, and uranium fountain pen were in his pocket, and a diamond and curium bauble clasped a tie, lovingly hand-painted by a female student. The argyles on his fuzzy ankles had been knitted by another. Still another devoted pupil had presented him with a hand-woven plastic case full of Frismill nuts to eat on the way back. "Well, Gnarly," Slood said, his face swelling with joy. "Well, well, you've put on weight, I see." Gnarly dropped into his old chair with a sigh. Slood might have picked something else to comment on first, his haggardness, for instance, or the increased spirituality of his expression. "Nothing else to do on Earth in your leisure moments but eat, I suppose," Slood said, pushing over the nut tray. "Even their food. Have some Frismills." "No, thank you," Gnarly replied coldly. Slood looked at him in distress. "Oh, how you must have suffered! Was it very, very bad, Gnarly?" Gnarly hunched low in his chair. "It was just awful." "I'm sure they didn't mean to be unkind," Slood assured him. "Naturally, you are a strange creature to them, and they're only unkind." Gnarly gave a bitter laugh. "They practically killed me with kindness. It was fuss, fuss, fuss all the time. Now, Gnarly, I do wish you wouldn't be quite so sarcastic. I'm not being sarcastic, and I wasn't a strange creature to them. It seems there's a sort of popular child's toy on Earth known as a, he winced, teddy bear. I aroused pleasant childhood memories in them, so they showered me with affection and edibles. Slood closed his eyes in anguish. You are very brave, Gnarly, he said almost reverently. Very brave and wise and good. Certainly that would be the best thing to tell our people. After all, the terrestrials are our allies. We don't want to stir up public sentiment against them. But you can be honest with me, Gnarly. Did they refuse to serve you in restaurants? Were you segregated in public vehicles? Did they shrink from you when you came close? Gnarly beat the desk with all four hands. I was hardly ever given the chance to be alone. They crawled all over me. Restaurants begged for my trade. I had to hire private vehicles because in public ones I was mobbed by admirers. Such a short time, Slood murmured, and already suspicious of even me, your oldest friend. But don't talk about it if you don't want to, Gnarly. Tell me, though, did they sneer at you and whisper half-audible insults? Did they— You're right, Gnarly snapped. I don't want to talk about it. Slood placed a comforting hand upon his shoulder. Perhaps that's wisest until the shock of your experience has worn off. Gnarly made an irritable noise. The Purzils are giving a Vilbar Party tonight, Slood said. But I know how you feel about parties. I've told them you're exhausted from your trip and won't be able to make it. Oh, you did you? Gnarly asked ironically. What makes you think you know how I feel about parties? But there's an interesting saying on Earth. Travel is so broadening. He looked down at his bulges with tolerant amusement. In more way than one, in case the meaning eludes you. Very sound psychologically. I've discovered that I like parties. I like being liked. If you'll excuse me, I'm going to inform the Purzils that I shall be delighted to come to their party. Care to join me? Well, Slood mumbled, I'd like to, but I have so much work. Introvert, said Gnarly, and he began dialing the Purzils. If you're enjoying the stories, hit the like button to support the channel and help this video spread. Thanks. The Man Outside by Evelyn E. Smith. Narrated by William Skye. No one, least of all Martin, could dispute that a man's life should be guarded by his kin. But by those who hadn't been born yet? Nobody in the neighbourhood was surprised when Martin's mother disappeared and Ninian came to take care of him. Mothers had a way of disappearing around those parts, and the kids were often better off without them. Martin was no exception. He'd never had it this good while he was living with his old lady. As for his father, Martin had never had one. He'd been a war baby, born of one of the tides of soldiers, enemies and allies both, that had engulfed the country in successive waves and bought or taken the women. So there was no trouble that way. Sometimes he wondered who Ninian really was. Obviously that story about her coming from the future was just a gag. Besides, if she really was his great-great-granddaughter, as she said, why would she tell him to call her Aunt Ninian? Maybe he was only 11, but he'd been around, and he knew just what the score was. At first he thought maybe she was some new kind of social worker, but she acted a little too crazy for that. He loved to bait her, as he had loved to bait his mother. It was safer with Ninian, though, because when he pushed her too far, she would cry instead of mopping up the floor with him. But I can't understand, he would say, keeping his face straight. Why do you have to come from the future to protect me against your cousin Conrad? Because he's coming to kill you. Why should he kill me? I ain't done him nothing. Ninian sighed. He's dissatisfied with the current social order, and killing you is part of an elaborate plan he's formulated to change it. You wouldn't understand. You're damn right, I don't understand. What's it all about in straight gas? Oh, just don't ask any questions. Ninian said petulantly. "When you get older, someone will explain the whole thing to you." So Martin held his peace, because, on the whole, he liked things the way they were. Ninian really was the limit, though. All the people he knew lived in scabrous tenement apartments like his, but she seemed to think it was disgusting. "So if you don't like it, clean it up," he suggested. She looked at him as if he were out of his mind. "Hire a maid, then," he jeered. And darned if that dope didn't go out and get a woman to come clean up the place. He was so embarrassed he didn't even dare show his face in the streets, especially with the women buttonholing him and demanding to know what gave. They tried talking to Ninian, but she certainly knew how to give them the cold shoulder. One day the truant officer came to ask why Martin hadn't been coming to school. Very few of the neighbourhood kids attended classes very regularly, so this was just routine. But Ninian didn't know that, and she went into a real tizzy, babbling that Martin had been sick and would make up the work. Martin nearly did get sick from laughing so hard inside. But he laughed out of the other side of his mouth when she went out and hired a private tutor for him. A tutor in that neighbourhood? Martin had to beat up every kid on the block before he could walk a step without hearing "fancy pants" yelled after him. Ninian worried all the time. It wasn't that she cared what these people thought of her, for she made no secret of regarding them as little better than animals, but she was shy of attracting attention. There were an awful lot of people in that neighbourhood who felt exactly the same way, only she didn't know that either. She was really pretty dumb, Martin thought, for all her fancy lingo. "It's so hard to think these things out without any prior practical application to go by," she told him. He nodded, knowing what she meant was that everything was coming out wrong. But he didn't try to help her. He just watched to see what she'd do next. Already he had begun to assume the detached role of a spectator. When it became clear that his mother was never going to show up again, Ninian bought one of those smallish, almost identical houses that mushroom on the fringes of a city after every war, particularly where intensive bombing has created a number of desirable building sites. "This is a much better neighbourhood for a boy to grow up in," she declared. "Besides, it's easier to keep an eye on you here." And keep an eye on him she did. She, or a rather foppish young man who came to stay with them occasionally. Martin was told to call him Uncle Raymond. From time to time there were other visitors, Uncle Ives and Bartholomew and Olaf, Aunts Ottilie and Grania and Lalage, and many more, all cousins to one another, he was told, all descendants of his. Martin was never left alone for a minute. He wasn't allowed to play with the other kids in the new neighbourhood. Not that their parents would have let them anyway. The adults obviously figured that if a one-car family hired private tutors for their kid, there must be something pretty wrong with him. So Martin and Ninian were just as conspicuous as before. But he didn't tip her off. She was grown up. She was supposed to know better than he did. He lived well. He had food to eat that he'd never dreamed of before, warm clothes that no one had ever worn before him. He was surrounded by more luxury than he knew what to do with. The furniture was the latest new Grand Rapids African modern. There were tidy, colourful Picasso and Braque prints on the walls, and every inch of the floor was modestly covered by carpeting, though the walls were mostly unabashed glass. There were hot water and heat all the time, and a freezer well stocked with food, somewhat erratically chosen, for Ninian didn't know much about meals. The non-glass part of the house was of neat, natural-toned wood, with a neat green lawn in front and a neat party-coloured garden in back. Martin missed the old neighbourhood, though. He missed having other kids to play with. He even missed his mother. Sure, she hadn't given him enough to eat, and she'd beaten him up so hard sometimes that she'd nearly killed him. But then there had also been times when she'd hugged and kissed him and soaked his collar with her tears. She'd done all she could for him, supporting him in the only way she knew how. And if respectable society didn't like it, the hell with respectable society. From Ninian and her cousins, there was only an impersonal kindness. They made no bones about the fact that they were there only to carry out a rather unpleasant duty. Though they were in the house with him, in their minds and in their talk, they were living in another world, a world of warmth and peace and plenty, where nobody worked, except in the government service or the essential professions. And they seemed to think even that kind of job was pretty low class, though better than actually doing anything with the hands. In their world, Martin came to understand, nobody worked with hands. Everything was done by machinery. All the people ever did was wear pretty clothes and have good times and eat all they wanted. There was no devastation, no war, no unhappiness, none of the concomitants of normal living. It was then that Martin began to realize that either the whole lot of them were insane, or what Ninian had told him at first was the truth. They came from the future. When Martin was 16, Raymond took him aside for the talk Ninian had promised 5 years before. "The whole thing's all my brother Conrad's fault. You see, he's an idealist," Raymond explained, pronouncing the last word with distaste. Martin nodded gravely. He was a quiet boy now, his brief past a dim and rather ridiculous memory. Who could ever imagine him robbing a grocery store or wielding a broken bottle now? He still was rather undersized, and he'd read so much that he'd weakened his eyes and had to wear glasses. His face was pallid because he spent little time in the sun, and his speech rather overbred, his mentors from the future having carefully eradicated all current vulgarities. "And Conrad really got upset over the way Earth has been exploiting the not-so-intelligent life forms on the other planets," Raymond continued. "Which is distressing, though of course it's not as if they were people. Besides, the government has been talking about passing laws to do away with abuses and things like that, and I'm sure someday everything will come out all right. However, Conrad is so impatient." "I thought in your world machines did all the work," Martin suggested. "I've told you, our world is precisely the same as this one," Raymond snapped. "We just come a couple of centuries or so later, that's all. But remember, our interests are identical. We're virtually the same people, although it is amazing what a difference 200-odd years of progress and polish can make in a species, isn't it?" He continued more mildly. "However, even you ought to be able to understand that we can't make machinery without metal. We need food. All that sort of thing comes from the out-system planets. And on those worlds, it's far cheaper to use native labor than to ship out all that expensive machinery. After all, if we didn't give the natives jobs, how would they manage to live?" "How did they live before? Come to think of it, if you don't work, how do you live now? I don't mean in the now for me, but the now for you," Martin explained laboriously. It was so difficult to live in the past and think in the future. "I'm trying to talk to you as if you were an adult," Raymond said, "but if you will persist in these childish interruptions—" "I'm sorry," Martin said. But he wasn't, for by now he had little respect left for any of his descendants. They were all exceedingly handsome and cultivated young people, with superior educations, smooth ways of speaking, and considerable self-confidence, but they just weren't very bright. And he had discovered that Raymond was perhaps the most intelligent of the lot. Somewhere in that relatively short span of time, his line, or more frightening, his race, had lost something vital. Unaware of the near contempt in which his young ancestor held him, Raymond went on blandly. "Anyhow, Conrad took it upon himself to feel particularly guilty because, he decided, if it hadn't been for the fact that our great-grandfather discovered the superdrive, we might never have reached the stars. Which is ridiculous, his feeling guilty, I mean. Perhaps a great-grandfather is responsible for his great-grandchildren, but a great-grandchild can hardly be held accountable for his great-grandfather." "How about a great-great-grandchild?" Martin couldn't help asking. Raymond flushed a delicate pink. "Do you want to hear the rest of this, or don't you?" "Oh, I do," Martin said. He had pieced the whole thing together for himself long since, but he wanted to hear how Raymond would put it. "Unfortunately, Professor Farkas has just perfected the time transmitter. Those government scientists are so infernally officious, always inventing such senseless things. It's supposed to be hush-hush, but you know how news will leak out when one is always desperate for a fresh topic of conversation." Anyhow, Raymond went on to explain, Conrad had bribed one of Farkas's assistants for a set of the plans. Conrad's idea had been to go back in time and eliminate their common great-grandfather. In that way there would be no space drive, and hence the terrestrials would never get to other planets and oppress the local aborigines. "Sounds like a good way of dealing with the problem," Martin observed. Raymond looked annoyed. "It's the adolescent way," he said. "To do away with it rather than find a solution. Would you destroy a whole society in order to root out a single injustice? Not if it were a good one otherwise. Well, there's your answer. Conrad got the apparatus built, or perhaps he built it himself. One doesn't inquire too closely into such matters. But when it came to the point, Conrad couldn't bear the idea of eliminating our great-grandfather, because our great-grandfather was such a good man, you know? Raymond's expressive upper lip curled. So Conrad decided to go further back still and get rid of his great-grandfather's father, who'd been, by all accounts, a pretty worthless character. That would be me, I suppose, Martin said quietly. Raymond turned a deep rose. Well, doesn't that just go to prove you mustn't believe everything you hear? The next sentence tumbled out in a rush. I wormed the whole thing out of him, and all of us, the other cousins and me, held a council of war, as it were, and we decided it was our moral duty to go back in time ourselves and protect you. He beamed at Martin. The boy smiled slowly. Of course, you had to. If Conrad succeeded in eliminating me, then none of you would exist, would you? Raymond frowned. Then he shrugged, cheerfully. Well, you didn't really suppose we were going to all this trouble and expense out of sheer altruism, did you? He asked, turning on the charm which all the cousins possessed to a consternating degree. Martin had, of course, no illusions on that score. He had learned long ago that nobody did anything for nothing. But saying so was unwise. We bribed another set of plans out of another of the professor's assistants, Raymond continued, as if Martin had answered, and, induced a handicraft enthusiast to build the gadget for us. Induced, Martin knew, could have meant anything from blackmail to the use of the Iron Maiden. Then we were all ready to forestall Conrad. If one of us guarded you night and day, he would never be able to carry out his plot. So we made our counterplan, set the machine as far back as it would go, and here we are. I see, Martin said. Raymond didn't seem to think he really did. After all, he pointed out defensively, whatever our motives, it has turned into a good thing for you. Nice home, cultured companions, all the contemporary conveniences, plus some handy anachronisms. I don't see what more you could ask for. You're getting the best of all possible worlds. Of course, Ninian was a ninny to locate in a mercantile suburb where any little thing out of the way will cause talk. How thankful I am that our era has completely disposed of the mercantiles. What did you do with them? Martin asked. But Raymond rushed on. Soon as Ninian goes and I'm in full charge, we'll get a more isolated place and run it on a far grander scale. Ostentation, that's the way to live here and now. The richer you are, the more eccentricity you can get away with. And, he added, I might as well be as comfortable as possible while I suffer through this wretched historical stint. So Ninian's going, said Martin, wondering why the news made him feel curiously desolate. Because, although he supposed he liked her in a remote kind of way, he had no fondness for her, or she, he knew, for him. Well, 5 years is rather a long stretch for any girl to spend in exile, Raymond explained, even though our lifespans are a bit longer than yours. Besides, you're getting too old now to be under petticoat government. He looked inquisitively at Martin. You're not going to go all weepy and make a scene when she leaves, are you? No, Martin said hesitantly. Oh, I suppose I will miss her. But we aren't very close, so it won't make a real difference. That was the sad part. He already knew it wouldn't make a difference. Raymond clapped him on the shoulder. I knew you weren't a sloppy sentimentalist like Conrad, though you do have rather a look of him, you know. Suddenly that seemed to make Conrad real. Martin felt a vague stirring of alarm. He kept his voice composed, however. How do you plan to protect me when he comes? Well, each one of us is armed to the teeth, of course, Raymond said with modest pride, displaying something that looked like a child's combination spaceman's gun and death ray, but which Martin had no doubt was a perfectly genuine and lethal weapon. And we've got a rather elaborate burglar alarm system. Martin inspected the system and made 1 or 2 changes in the wiring which he felt would increase its efficiency. But still he was dubious. Maybe it'll work on someone coming from outside this house, but do you think it will work on someone coming from outside this time? Never fear, it has a temporal radius, Raymond replied. Factory guarantee and all that. Just to be on the safe side, Martin said, I think I'd better have one of those guns too. A splendid idea, enthused Raymond. I was just about to think of that myself. When it came time for the parting, it was Ninian who cried. Tears at her own inadequacy, Martin knew, not of sorrow. He was getting skillful at understanding his descendants, far better than they at understanding him. But then they never really tried. Ninian kissed him wetly on the cheek and said she was sure everything would work out all right and that she'd come to see him again. She never did, though, except at the very last. Raymond and Martin moved into a luxurious mansion in a remote area. The site proved a well-chosen one. When the Second Atomic War came, 6 years later, they weren't touched. Martin was never sure whether this had been sheer luck or expert planning. Probably luck, because his descendants were exceedingly inept planners. Few people in the world then could afford to live as stylishly as Martin and his guardian. The place not only contained every possible convenience and gadget, but was crammed with bibelots and antiques, carefully chosen by Raymond and disputed by Martin, for to the man from the future, all available artifacts were antiques. Otherwise, Martin accepted his new surroundings. His sense of wonder had become dulled by now, and the pink pseudo-Spanish castle, architecturally dreadful of course, Raymond had said, but so hilariously typical, impressed him far less than had the suburban split-level aquarium. "How about a moat?" Martin suggested when they first came. "It seems to go with a castle." "Do you think a moat could stop Conrad?" Raymond asked, amused. "No," Martin smiled, feeling rather silly, "but it would make the place seem safer somehow." The threat of Conrad was beginning to make him grow more and more nervous. He got Raymond's permission to take 2 suits of armour that stood in the front hall and present them to a local museum, because several times he fancied he saw them move. He also became an adept with the ray gun and changed the surrounding landscape quite a bit with it, until Raymond warned that this might lead Conrad to them. During those early years, Martin's tutors were exchanged for the higher-degreed ones that were now needful. The question inevitably arose of what the youth's vocation in that life was going to be. At least 20 of the cousins came back through time to hold one of their vigorous family councils. Martin was still young enough to enjoy such occasions, finding them vastly superior to all other forms of entertainment. "This sort of problem wouldn't arise in our day, Martin," Raymond commented as he took his place at the head of the table, "because unless one specifically feels a call to some profession or other, one just, drifts along happily." "Ours is a wonderful world," Grania sighed at Martin. "I only wish we could take you there. I'm sure you would like it." "Don't be a fool, Grania," Raymond snapped. "Well, Martin, have you made up your mind what you want to be?" Martin affected to think. "A physicist," he said, not without malice. "Or perhaps an engineer." There was a loud, excited chorus of dissent. He chuckled inwardly. "Can't do that," Ives said. "Might pick up some concepts from us. Don't know how, none of us knows a thing about science. But it could happen. Subconscious osmosis, if there is such a thing. That way you might invent something ahead of time. And the fellow we got the plans from particularly cautioned us against that. Changing history. Dangerous." "Might mess up our time frightfully," Bartholomew contributed. "Though to be perfectly frank, I can't quite understand how." "I'm not going to sit down and explain the whole thing to you all over again, Bart," Raymond said impatiently. "Well, Martin?" "What would you suggest?" Martin asked. "How about becoming a painter? Art is eternal, and quite gentlemanly. Besides, artists are always expected to be either behind or ahead of their times." "Furthermore," Ortilli added, "one more artist couldn't make much difference in history. There were so many of them all through the ages." Martin couldn't hold back his question. "What was I actually in that other time?" There was a chilly silence. "Let's not talk about it, dear," Lalage finally said. "Let's just be thankful we've saved you from that." So drawing teachers were engaged, and Martin became a very competent second-rate artist. He knew he would never be able to achieve first rank because, even though he was still so young, his work was almost purely intellectual. The only emotion he seemed able to feel was fear, the ever-present fear that someday he would turn a corridor and walk into a man who looked like him, a man who wanted to kill him for the sake of an ideal. But the fear did not show in Martin's pictures. They were pretty pictures. Cousin Ives, now that Martin was older he was told to call the descendants cousin, next assumed guardianship. Ives took his responsibilities more seriously than the others did. He even arranged to have Martin's work shown at an art gallery. The paintings received critical approval, but failed to evoke any enthusiasm. The modest sale they enjoyed was mostly to interior decorators. Museums were not interested. "Takes time," Ives tried to reassure him. "One day they'll be buying your pictures, Martin. Wait and see." Ives was the only one of the descendants who seemed to think of Martin as an individual. When his efforts to make contact with the other young man failed, he got worried and decided that what Martin needed was a change of air and scenery. "Course, you can't go on the grand tour. Your son hasn't invented space travel yet. But we can go see this world, what's left of it. Tourists always like ruins best, anyway." So he drew on the family's vast future resources and bought a yacht which Martin christened the Interregnum. So they travelled from sea to ocean and from ocean to sea, touching at various ports and making trips inland. Martin saw the civilized world, mostly in fragments, the nearly intact semi-civilized world and the uncivilized world, much the same as it had been for centuries. It was like visiting an enormous museum. He couldn't seem to identify with his own time anymore. The other cousins appeared to find the yacht a congenial headquarters, largely because they could spend so much time far away from the contemporary inhabitants of the planet and relax and be themselves. So they never moved back to land. Martin spent the rest of his life on the Interregnum. He felt curiously safer from Conrad there, although there was no valid reason why an ocean should stop a traveller through time. More cousins were in residence at once than ever before, because they came for the ocean voyage. They spent most of their time aboard ship, giving each other parties and playing an avant-garde form of shuffleboard and gambling on future sporting events. That last usually ended in a brawl because one cousin was sure to accuse another of having got advance information about the results. Martin didn't care much for their company, and associated with them only when not to have done so would have been palpably rude. And though they were gregarious young people for the most part, they didn't court his society. He suspected that he made them feel uncomfortable. He rather liked Ives, though. Sometimes the two of them would be alone together. Then Ives would tell Martin of the future world he had come from. The picture drawn by Raymond and Ninian had not been entirely accurate, Ives admitted. True, there was no war or poverty on Earth proper, but that was because there were only a couple of million people left on the planet. It was an enclave for the highly privileged, highly interbred aristocracy, to which Martin's descendants belonged by virtue of their distinguished ancestry. "Rather feudal, isn't it?" Martin asked. Ives agreed, adding that the system had, however, been deliberately planned rather than the result of haphazard natural development. Everything potentially unpleasant, like the mercantiles, had been deported. "Not only natives living on the other worlds," Ives said as the two of them stood at the ship's rail, surrounded by the limitless expanse of some ocean or other. "People, too. Mostly lower classes, except for officials and things. With wars and want and suffering," he added regretfully. "Same as in your day. Like now, I mean," he corrected himself. "Maybe it is worse, the way Conrad thinks. More planets for us to make trouble on. 3 that were habitable aren't anymore. Bombed. Very thorough job." "Oh," Martin murmured, trying to sound shocked, horrified, interested even. "Sometimes I'm not altogether sure Conrad was wrong," Ives said after a pause. "Tried to keep us from getting to the stars, hurting the people, I expect you could call them people, there. Still," he smiled shamefacedly, "couldn't stand by and see my own way of life destroyed, could I?" "I suppose not," Martin said. "Would take moral courage. I don't have it. None of us does except Conrad, and even he." Ives looked out over the sea. "Must be a better way out than Conrad's," he said without conviction. "And everything will work out all right in the end. Bound to. No sense to anything if it doesn't." He glanced wistfully at Martin. "I hope so," said Martin. But he couldn't hope. He couldn't feel. He couldn't even seem to care. During all this time, Conrad still did not put in an appearance. Martin had gotten to be such a crack shot with the ray pistol that he almost wished his descendant would show up so there would be some excitement. But he didn't come, and Martin got to thinking. He always felt that if any of the cousins could have come to realize the basic flaw in the elaborate plan they had concocted, it would have been Ives. However, when the yacht touched at Tierra del Fuego one bitter winter, Ives took a severe chill. They sent for a doctor from the future, one of the descendants who had been eccentric enough to take a medical degree, but he wasn't able to save Ives. The body was buried in the frozen ground at Ushuaia on the southern tip of the continent, 100 years or more before the date of his birth. A great many of the cousins turned up at the simple ceremony. All were dressed in overwhelming black and showed a great deal of grief. Raymond read the burial service because they didn't dare summon a clerical cousin from the future. They were afraid he might prove rather stuffy about the entire undertaking. "He died for all of us," Raymond concluded his funeral eulogy over Ives, "so his death was not in vain." But Martin disagreed. The ceaseless voyaging began again. The interregnum voyage to every ocean and every sea. Some were blue, and some green, and some dun. After a while, Martin couldn't tell one from another. Cousin after cousin came to watch over him, and eventually they were as hard for him to tell apart as the different oceans. All the cousins were young, for though they came at different times in his life, they had all started out from the same time in theirs. Only the young ones had been included in the venture. They did not trust their elders. As the years went by, Martin began to lose even his detached interest in the land and its doings. Although the yacht frequently touched port for fuel or supplies, it was more economical to purchase them in that era than to have them shipped from the future. He seldom went ashore, and then only at the urging of a newly assigned cousin anxious to see the sights. Most of the time Martin spent in watching the sea, and sometimes he painted it. There seemed to be a depth to his seascapes that his other work lacked. When he was pressed by the current cousin to make a land visit somewhere, he decided to exhibit a few of his sea paintings. That way he could fool himself into thinking that there was some purpose to this journey. He'd come to believe that perhaps what his life lacked was purpose, and for a while he kept looking for meaning everywhere, to the cousin's utter disgust. "Eat, drink, and be merry, or whatever you Romans say when you do as you do," the cousin who was rather woolly in history, the descendants were scraping bottom now, advised. Martin showed his work in Italy so that the cousin could be disillusioned by the current crop of Romans. He found that neither purpose nor malice was enough. He was still immeasurably bored. However, a museum bought 2 of the paintings. Martin thought of Ives and felt an uncomfortable pang of a sensation he could no longer understand. "Where do you suppose Conrad has been all this time?" Martin idly asked the current cousin, who was passing as his nephew by now. The young man jumped, then glanced around him uncomfortably. "Conrad's a very shrewd fellow," he whispered. "He's biding his time, waiting until we're off guard, and then, pow, he'll attack." "Oh, I see," Martin said. He had often fancied that Conrad would prove to be the most stimulating member of the whole generation, but it seemed unlikely that he would ever have a chance for a conversation with the young man. More than one conversation, anyhow. "When he does show up, I'll protect you," the cousin vowed, touching his ray gun. "You haven't a thing to worry about." Martin smiled with all the charm he'd had nothing to do but acquire. "I have every confidence in you," he told his descendant. He himself had given up carrying a gun long ago. There was a war in the Northern Hemisphere, and so the interregnum voyaged to southern waters. There was a war in the South, and they hid out in the Arctic. All the nations became too drained of power, fuel and man and will to fight, so there was a sterile peace for a long time. The interregnum roamed the seas restlessly, with her load of passengers from the future, plus one bored and aging contemporary. She bore big guns now because of the ever-present danger of pirates. Perhaps it was the traditionally bracing effect of sea air, perhaps it was the sheltered life, but Martin lived to be a very old man. He was 104 when his last illness came. It was a great relief when the family doctor, called in again from the future, said there was no hope. Martin didn't think he could have borne another year of life. All the cousins gathered at the yacht to pay their last respects to their progenitor. He saw Ninian again, after all these years, and Raymond, all the others, dozens of them, thronging around his bed, spilling out of the cabin and into the passageways and out onto the deck, making their usual clamour, even though their voices were hushed. Only Ives was missing. He'd been the lucky one, Martin knew. He had been spared the tragedy that was going to befall these blooming young people, all the same age as when Martin had last seen them, and doomed never to grow any older. Underneath their masks of woe, he could see relief at the thought that, at last, they were going to be rid of their responsibility. And underneath Martin's death mask lay an impersonal pity for those poor, stupid descendants of his who had blundered so irretrievably. There was only one face which Martin had never seen before. It wasn't a strange face, however, because Martin had seen one very like it in the looking-glass when he was a young man. "You must be Conrad," Martin called across the cabin in a voice that was still clear. "I've been looking forward to meeting you for some time." The other cousins whirled to face the newcomer. "You're too late, Con," Raymond gloated for the whole generation. "He's lived out his life." "But he hasn't lived out his life," Conrad contradicted. "He's lived out the life you created for him, and for yourselves too." For the first time, Martin saw compassion in the eyes of one of his lineage, and found it vaguely disturbing. It didn't seem to belong there. "Don't you realize even yet," Conrad went on, "that as soon as he goes, you'll go too? Present, past, future, wherever you are, you'll go up in the air like puffs of smoke." "What do you mean?" Ninian quavered, her soft, pretty face alarmed. Martin answered Conrad's rueful smile, but left the explanations up to him. It was his show, after all. "Because you will never have existed," Conrad said. "You have no right to existence. It was you yourselves who watched him all the time, so he didn't have a chance to lead a normal life, get married, have children." Most of the cousins gasped as the truth began to percolate through. "I knew from the very beginning," Conrad finished, "that I didn't have to do anything at all. I just had to wait, and you would destroy yourselves." "I don't understand," Bartholomew protested, searching the faces of the cousins closest to him. "What does he mean, we have never existed? We're here, aren't we? What?" "Shut up," Raymond snapped. He turned on Martin. "You don't seem surprised." The old man grinned. "I'm not. I figured it all out years ago." At first he had wondered what he should do. Would it be better to throw them into a futile panic by telling them, or to do nothing? He had decided on the latter. That was the role they had assigned to him, to watch and wait and keep out of things, and that was the role he would play. "You knew all the time and you didn't tell us?" Raymond spluttered. "After we'd been so good to you, making a gentleman out of you instead of a criminal?" "That's right," he snarled. "A criminal, an alcoholic, a thief, a derelict. How do you like that?" "Sounds like a rich, full life," Martin said wistfully. What an exciting existence they must have done him out of. But then, he couldn't help thinking, he and Conrad together, of course, had done them out of any kind of existence. It wasn't his responsibility, though. He had done nothing but let matters take whatever course was destined for them. If only he could be sure that it was the better course, perhaps he wouldn't feel that nagging sense of guilt inside him. Strange. Where, in his hermetic life, could he possibly have developed such a queer thing as a conscience? "Then we've wasted all this time," Ninian sobbed. "All this energy, all this money, for nothing." "But you were nothing to begin with," Martin told them. And then, after a pause, he added, "I only wish I could be sure there had been some purpose to this." He didn't know whether it was approaching death that dimmed his sight, or whether the frightened crowd that pressed around him was growing shadowy. "I wish I could feel that some good had been done in letting you be wiped out of existence," he went on voicing his thoughts. "But I know that the same thing that happened to your world and my world will happen all over again. To other people in other times, but again. It's bound to happen. There isn't any hope for humanity." One man couldn't really change the course of human history, he told himself. Two men, that was. One real, one a shadow. Conrad came close to the old man's bed. He was almost transparent. No, he said, there is hope. They didn't know the time transmitter works 2 ways. I used it for going into the past only once, just this once. But I've gone into the future with it many times. And, he pressed Martin's hand, believe me, what I did, what we did, you and I, serves a purpose. It will change things for the better. Everything is going to be all right. Was Conrad telling him the truth, Martin wondered, or was he just giving the conventional reassurance to the dying? More than that, was he trying to convince himself that what he had done was the right thing? Every cousin had assured Martin that things were going to be all right. Was Conrad actually different from the rest? His plan had worked, and the others hadn't, but then all his plan had consisted of doing was nothing. That was all he and Martin had done. Nothing. Were they absolved of all responsibility merely because they had stood aside and taken advantage of the others' weaknesses? Why, Martin said to himself, in a sense it could be said that I have fulfilled my original destiny, that I am a criminal. Well, it didn't matter. Whatever happened, no one could hold him to blame. He held no stake in the future that was to come. It was other men's future, other men's problem. He died very peacefully then, and since he was the only one left on the ship, there was nobody to bury him. The unmanned yacht drifted about the seas for years, and gave rise to many legends, none of them as unbelievable as the truth. Remember to hit the like button if you're enjoying the stories. Thanks. Man's Best Friend by Evelyn E. Smith. Narrated by William Skye. Sometimes a job comes after the man, and this one came after Gervais like a tiger. The Annunciator aroused Gervais from pleasant semi-slumber. He knew the interruption was his own fault for not having turned off the device, but he so seldom had a visitor that he could hardly be blamed for his forgetfulness. Frowning, he pressed the viewer button. A round red face appeared on the screen. "May I be the first to congratulate you, Mr. Schnee?" it said. You may indeed," Gervais replied. "But for what?" "You haven't heard the news? Good, then I'm the first. I imagine I got a head start on the others because of my superior facilities for locating you. Your address wasn't given. These pronouncements do tend to be a bit vague. Matter of tradition, I suppose." "I haven't heard any news for days," Gervais said, uncomfortably conscious that he was apologizing. "I've been listening to my sound tapes and meditating," he added defiantly. "Wait a minute, I'll let you in." He struggled with the door stud, but the door refused to open. The auto bursar must have neglected to pay the door bill, probably because Gervais had failed to put enough money into it. But his allowance was limited, and sound tapes, not to speak of meditators, were so expensive. Sighing, Gervais got up and opened the door manually. The individual outside was short and stout and dressed, unfortunately, in the uniform of an upper-echelon salesman. Gervais had been caught. Still, he reminded himself, no one could force him to buy anything. He was a free citizen. "Well, come in if you must," he said grudgingly. "I suppose the big news is that I'm the lucky householder to whom the little gem room expander will first be offered." "Nothing of the sort," the man replied indignantly. At this point, Gervais noticed with surprise that the other wore a jewelled merchant prince's badge. Apparently, this was one of those consumer reaction tests in which executives themselves participated to check on their employees. The man remembered to smile. "The prognosticator has just given its fortnightly prognostication. You, Mr. Schnee, are going to be our new ruler." He seized the young man's limp hand and shook it enthusiastically. "And I'm sure you'll be a splendid one, too." Gervais accepted a pale green cheroot from the dispenser. It shook in his lips. "And what's to become of the old ruler?" "You're scheduled to dispose of him some time this month. Now, Mr. Schnee," the man went on briskly, "allow me to introduce myself. I am Bedrich Floria, Vice President of the Floria Munitions and Container Corporation." He extracted a gleaming weapon from his briefcase and offered it to Gervais. The young man recoiled. If you will only agree to shoot Overlord Kip with a Floria Semper Fidelis gun, the executive continued, my corporation will be happy to place a substantial amount of credits at your disposal in any bank you choose. 6 billion to be exact. Now, if you'll just sign here on the dotted line. He held out a stylus temptingly. Nonsense, Gervais backed away. Even a ruler can use money. Bribery for government officials, bread and circuses for the people. Oh, money's a very useful commodity, Mr. Schnee. Shall we say 7 billion? I don't doubt that money is useful, Gervais replied, thinking wistfully of 7 billion credits. But when I said nonsense, I meant the prognosticator. The whole thing's a lot of, well, nonsense. A whole planet of supposedly intelligent people listening to what's nothing more, really, than an oracle. A machine can't read the future. It's impossible. Floria's eyes bulged. Mr. Schnee, that's sacrilege. You can't... Confounded, sir, you can't talk that way about the machine. After all, he added in a more placatory manner, let's look at this reasonably. Machines can and do answer all the problems of our daily life, so why shouldn't a superior machine be able to tell the future? If you ask me, Gervais all but sneered, behind the wires and gimmicks and whatnots in the machine, there's a secret room in which a half-mad, half-intoxicated old priestess sits delivering her Delphic pronouncements. Might as well have an above-board oracle and be done with it. Now, Mr. Schnee, the executive smiled with obvious effort. Even our ruler shouldn't flout the authority of machinery. Of course, it's all right when you're alone with friends, like me, but in public... The enunciator sounded again. An eager face appeared on the screen. Mr. Schnee, an equally eager voice said, I'm from the Daily Disseminator. How does it feel to be ruler prognosticate? There was the sound of a scuffle. His face disappeared, to be replaced by 2 others. Mr. Schnee, will you tell us in your very own words? As Gervais clicked off the interviewer, the vidophone blinked. Gervais lifted the receiver. The face of Overlord Kip himself came into view, pale but composed. I understand you're the young man who is destined to dispose of me and take my place. Gervais paled also. Honestly, your honourship, I haven't the slightest intent... You'll make it quick and painless, won't you? And it really would be very decent of you to give me the exact day and hour of my, demise, so I won't have to sit around waiting. But really, you don't look like a hard-hearted chap. As a matter of fact, I would say offhand that you had a kind face. Well, thank you, but I do wish you'd stop shilly-shallying and name the day. By the way, have you anything on for tomorrow? I didn't have anything special planned. Splendid. Suppose you come over to the palace around 1 o'clock or so. We can have a bite of lunch and discuss the matter together. After all, I think you'll agree that I have been a reasonably good ruler, and so I have the right to die with dignity. He looked pleadingly at Gervais. Oh, absolutely, the young man said in haste. No question of it. I think it's a very good idea to have a chat about it first. Awkward to dispose of someone you haven't met previously. The dictator gave him a wan smile. Thank you, Mr. Schnee. I hope you'll find your successor as cooperative as yourself. The screen darkened. Gervais mused. He took a lavender cheroot, forgetting he still held the lime one. I wonder whether he wants to make an appointment so he'll have a band of counter-assassins ready to kill me, saving him the expense of a standby guard. He is noted for his thriftiness, you know. Perhaps I just shouldn't show up at all. He wouldn't dream of doing anything of the sort, Floria said austerely. Overlord Kip knows what is due to his position. He has a sense of duty and responsibility which, unfortunately, seems to be lacking in his successor, if you'll excuse my speaking frankly, he added in haste. I am, of course, considerably older than you, and so I feel it's quite all right, Gervais reassured him. He may speak freely. Furthermore, Floria continued, if he had you killed, the people would probably give him a painful and lingering death for attempting to interfere with the course of destiny. There, I hear them now. And they could indeed hear the sound of voices raised in song, so many and so loud that they penetrated the soundproofing of the walls. The Polloi are coming to hail their new leader, Floria beamed. Well, I'm not going to do it, Gervais declared. They can't make me kill him and take over, and that's flat. I'm not the administrative type, never have been. Floria took a cheroot of his own out of a platinum portable. In that case, the people will probably kill you for attempting to interfere with fate. But I wouldn't have done anything, Gervais protested. There are sins of omission as well as commission. Come now, it's true a ruler's life expectancy isn't very long, at least it hasn't been for the last few reigns, but it's longer than yours will be if you refuse to fulfill your destiny. I wouldn't make a fit ruler, Gervais said desperately. Consider my origins. I wouldn't tell this to anyone but you. I'm illegitimate. I don't even know who my father is. The other man smiled again. It's a wise child who knows his own father, and some of the most celebrated leaders in history have been illegitimate. Look at William the Conqueror. Gervais turned on the historiscope, dialed 1066 AD, looked, shuddered, and turned it off. I don't think that's much of a recommendation. You see, Floria told him encouragingly, almost anybody can be a leader. The important thing is that he be destined for leadership. But I'm no good. Everybody says so. I've never done a thing in my life. My aged mother has had to work to support me. Time enough that you stood on your 2 feet, my boy, the businessman said, clapping the youth upon the shoulder. And remember, destiny must take its course. He flung open the door. A cheering crowd stood outside. My friends, allow me to introduce you to your new ruler, Gervais Schnee. A hoarse shout of approval went up. He is planning to assassinate Overlord Kip with a Floria Semper Fidelis gun. Floria Semper Fidelis guns retail from 2.98 credits for the Peasant's Pistol, all the way up to 1,089.56 credits for the Super Deluxe Conspiratus model, but each is the best obtainable for the price. Mr. Schnee, of course, will use the Super Deluxe model. There were more cries, cheers and shouts. Thank you for your confidence and support, Gervais said brokenly. I only hope I prove worthy of them. Gervais lunched with Overlord Kip the next day and was not assassinated. The disposal was set for the coming Tuesday and announced to the public. Gervais was so nervous he couldn't sleep the night before. When, early in the morning, he finally did manage to doze off, he was awakened by the encouraging telegrams that kept pouring in. At 9, he finally got up and dressed himself in the immaculate black and silver assassin's uniform that had been custom made for him without charge by an eminent tailor. He was in no mood for breakfast, so he went outside to the handsome black and silver limousine that had been presented to him by a thoughtful industrialist. As he emerged from his door, a brass band struck up the national anthem, and the crowd waiting outside broke into cheers suitably restrained to fit the melancholy occasion. Gervais bowed wanly left and right as he got into the car. His 2 hired assistants, dressed in the customary black cloak and hood of the body remover, were, he noticed, already seated beside the chauffeur. They did not turn their heads as Gervais entered, but preserved the traditional impassivity of their calling. The band started to play a funeral march as the car moved slowly down the boulevard. Stands had been put up all along the route, and he was greeted by subdued cheering and applause from crowds neatly arranged according to rank. Little children of all classes rushed out into the street to present him with bouquets of flowers. The television cameras joined him en route and followed him all the way to the palace. On the steps, Bedrich Floria awaited him, magnificently garbed in full executive uniform, his jewels flashing in the clear sunlight. Allow me to load your Super Deluxe Conspirators Floria Semper Fidelis gun for you, Overlord Prognosticate, he announced in a ringing voice as he turned his profile towards the cameras. It's already loaded, Gervais said, nervously clutching the gun in his pocket. Permit me to check it then, Floria put out an eager hand. Gervais executed a deft chassé in the opposite direction. It's perfectly all right, I tell you. No one, he added in a burst of inspiration, have any difficulty in loading a Floria Semper Fidelis gun. That's right, the baffled munitions magnate admitted, falling back reluctantly. Whether you buy the peasants or the conspirators model, both have the same smooth, free-loading mechanism. Out of the way, executive, a cameraman said, unceremoniously sweeping Floria aside as Gervais paced into the palace, followed by his 2 black-robed henchmen, carrying an elaborate gold-mounted stretcher between them. Candy, popcorn, hashish, yogurt, yelled a strident voice behind them. Buy your refreshments here. Overlord Kip stood beside his desk, dressed in his finest uniform, which was, however, virtually invisible, it was so bedecked with glittering and sparkling medals and decorations. Gervais waited patiently while the soon-to-be-disposed-of ruler made a speech pointing out the numerous benefits and improvements his reign had brought to the people. It was rather a long speech, and Gervais's nose began to itch. He would have liked to scratch it, but the cameras were pointing directly at him. Life as ruler, he saw, was going to be a long series of similar repressions. He sighed. But what could he do? Nobody could go against the prognostications. Finally, the speech was finished. "Goodbye and good luck, Overlord Schnee," Kip said. He stood, waiting. Gervais fired. There was a loud report. Kip crumpled to the ground. Gervais hurled the Floria Semper Fidelis gun to the desk. "Everyone will now please leave," he ordered in calm but firm tones, "while the removers take over." "Why can't we televise the removal?" a daring cameraman asked. "Something new." There was a shocked silence and then a babble of indignant voices. Gervais held up a weary hand. The voices stopped. "That sort of thing just isn't done," he told the cameraman with an Olympian smile. "Please leave as quickly as possible, all of you. I might want to meditate." They scuttled out backward, the cameras still grinding. Gervais pressed the studs that shut and bolted the door. "Whew," said Overlord Kip, sitting up. "I didn't think I'd be able to stand that much longer. You're a good shot, Snee. That blank stung like crazy. And in a very tender spot, I might add." "No time for chatting," Gervais said nervously. "We've got to get this over in a hurry. Now comes the part when your friends will have to look like real removers. I hope they can give it that professional touch." "We are real removers in a sense," said one of the black-robed figures. "At least both of us have participated in removals before." They dropped their hoods. Gervais's mouth hung open. "Why, you're Overlord Morehouse," he said to one. "And I've seen pictures of you," he told the other. "You're the one that came before him, Shinnick. You died before I was born. That is, you were supposed to have died. Both of you were. Morehouse was supposed to have killed you." Ex-Overlord Shinnick smiled. "We're not precisely dead, only retired, you might say. In a way, anonymity is the same as death. And Overlords Morehouse and Kip," he bowed toward them, "both had kind hearts, like yourself. The prognosticator didn't say we had to be killed, just disposed of, as Kip undoubtedly pointed out to you in your little talk together." "Sorry I couldn't tell you the truth," Kip apologized as he dusted off his uniform. "But you might have changed your mind and given us away." "We formed a sort of little club of dead overlords," Shinnick elucidated. "After all, we're the only ones with whom we can associate safely. No danger of any one of us betraying the others." "We're looking forward to the day when you join us, Overlord Schnee," Morehouse put in eagerly. "Assuming that your successor is of as generous a nature as we, of course. Do you play bridge by any chance?" "You'd better hurry," Gervais worriedly changed the subject as he noticed the time on the wall chronometer. "If the four of us are discovered, the mob will tear us all to pieces." "Right you are," said ex-Overlord Shinnick. "Get on the stretcher, Kip. Bad enough we're going to have to carry you out, at least don't expect us to lift you up." Kip obediently assumed a recumbent posture. Shinnick and Morehouse covered him with a black cloth and were preparing to march out when Gervais recollected himself and halted them. "Wait a moment. You'd better take off those medals first, Kip. They come with the job." "Grave robber," said Kip, reluctantly sitting up on his catafalque and unfastening the jewelled decorations. When the little procession had left, Gervais pressed a stud on the desk marked Secretary. A panel in the wall opened and a timorous-looking man virtually fell into the room. Yes, your honourship?" "The prognosticator is right here in the palace, isn't it?" Gervais asked, in a tone that would have been authoritative if his voice hadn't cracked right in the middle of palace. Yes, your honourship." "Lead me to it immediately." Certainly, your honourship." As they left the room, Gervais picked the Floria Semper Fidelis gun off the desk. It was too valuable a piece of property to leave lying around. The palace was full of sticky-fingered civil servants. They passed through room after room containing bank after bank of computing machines, each more complicated in appearance than the last. Hordes of officials in the garb of hereditary scientist or technician bowed low as the new ruler passed. The machines, of course, operated and repaired themselves automatically. Nonetheless, they needed a good many attendants as befitted their exalted status. Gervais and his guide finally came to the room where the prognosticator itself was enshrined. The apartment was 20 stories high and 100 meters wide, but it was none too large for all the flashing lights and spinning dials and buzzing relays and levers and cables which jammed it. The hundreds of first-rank scientists who waited upon the machine stopped their task of dusting and polishing to greet the new usurper with deferent acclaim. "Leave me," he ordered, gesturing with the gun toward the door. "I will be alone with the prognosticator." "Certainly, your honourship, certainly." Your wishes are our commands." They backed out. "You too," Gervais told the secretary who had guided him. Yes, Your Honourship." The man skittered off. When they had all gone, Gervais approached a small, unobtrusive door marked "Danger, no admittance." Dust lay thick on the sill, for it was seldom opened. Gervais took a tiny, intricate piece of metal from his pocket and fitted it into the lock. Something inside clicked. The door swung open. Beyond, a narrow flight of steps spiraled downward. Gervais descended them unhesitatingly until he came to another small door. This one was simply marked "Private." He knocked on it. "Ah, go butter your earlobes," a cracked voice called from within. "Can't you read, you dumb cluck?" "It's me, Gervais," he pounded on the door with the butt of his gun. "Open up." The door swung open creakily. Through the gloom inside there could be dimly seen antique furnishings in a poor state of preservation, and a still more imperfect state of cleanliness. An outmodedly streamlined 20th century typewriting machine was set on a costly metal stand with one caster missing. The flaps of the table were open. One held a chipped teapot, the other a dusty crystal ball and a dog-eared pack of gypsy cards. Behind all this was a rare old psychoanalyst couch, ripped open here and there and showing the original stuffing. Reclining on the couch was an incredibly old woman wearing a quaint costume of a bygone era. Long scarlet silk skirt, yellow blouse, great golden hoops swinging in her ears. She was sipping something out of a teacup, but it didn't smell like tea, at least not like tea alone. The ancient reek of gin pervaded and overpowered the general mustiness. "Hello, son," the old woman said, waving the cup at Gervais. "About time you came to pay your old mother a visit," she cackled. "I can't have thought something like this would stir you up." "Mother," Gervais said reproachfully, "you know you shouldn't have done it." "What did I do?" she asked, assuming a ludicrous posture of innocence. "You fixed the prognostications, that's what you did. Although why you had to pick on me—" I got tired of supporting you. You're a big boy, it's about time you earned your own living. Besides, I thought it would be a good idea to elect a sympathetic administration. Sympathetic to me, that is. Palace needs a new ventilating system. Air in here is terrible. Smells as if something died and they were too stingy to give it a decent burial." "But why didn't you use the prognosticator to get new ventilation put in?" Gervais asked. "Seems to me you could have foretold everyone in the palace would suffocate or something if it wasn't done." "They'd have got around it, same way you got around killing Kip." Gervais blushed. "You can't fool me," she cackled gleefully. "I know everything that goes on around this place, and a lot that doesn't." She reached over and tapped his knee. "But you'll pay attention to the prognosticator, boy. Don't you try to weasel out of what it says by looking for double meanings. Time you overlords learned that when the prognosticator says something, it means it." "Yes, Mother," he said. "I'd hate to have to give orders to have my own boy disposed of. The last 3 disposals weren't so bad, but sometimes those things can turn out real messy." "Yes, Mother." She drank gustily from her teacup. "Maybe blood is thicker than water, but not much." "Yes, Mother." "And why shouldn't you listen to my prognostications?" she demanded irritably, slamming her teacup down on the table so hard that the typewriter skipped. "Just because they're dolled up a little doesn't mean they're not true. Don't I have a crystal ball? Don't I have a gypsy tarot pack? Don't I have tea leaves? Best tea money can buy, too." "Yes, Mother." "So?" She looked at him expectantly. "What are you going to do?" Gervais took a deep breath and drew himself up. "I'm going to have the ventilating system attended to right away." "That's my boy," she said fondly, draining another cup of tea and peering at the leaves. "I can see everything's going to work out fine. Just fine."
Thanks for listening. Hit the like button if you think the video deserves it, and subscribe for more every Monday and Friday. And remember, you can get more Evelyn E. Smith plus dozens of great sci-fi writers on my Patreon. There you'll find monthly exclusive novelettes including Once a Greech by Smith, Pillar of Fire by Ray Bradbury, and Omnilingual by H. Beam Piper. Head to patreon.com/storiesfromthesky_SFF, link in the description. And staying on YouTube, you can find another author collection with 5 sci-fi short stories by Ray Bradbury. A link to that video is on screen now.